The air in the control room was cool and hummed with a low, constant energy. It was a sound David had grown so used to that he only noticed it in its absence. A deep thrumming from the massive machine just outside, a giant dish carved into a Puerto Rican valley, listening to the stars. For David, a graduate student in astronomy, this place, the Arecibo Observatory, was more than a job. It was a temple, and he was one of its quiet acolytes. It was a morning like any other in September of 1998. The tropical sun was still hidden, and the sky outside the wide windows was a deep, inky blue. Most of the night shift astronomers had stumbled off to bed, and the day shift hadn't fully arrived yet. In this quiet in-between time, David had the office to himself. His desk was a tiny island in a sea of chaos. Towers of computer monitors, tangles of wires, and precarious stacks of scientific papers formed a canyon around him. His task for the day was not glamorous. It was, in fact, the kind of work that made many of his fellow students groan. He was sifting through old data, months and months of signals that the giant telescope had already collected, recorded, and filed away. It was like being a detective, but instead of looking for a fingerprint on a glass, he was looking for a single unusual whisper in a recording of a crowded, roaring football stadium. You see, the universe is incredibly loud, but almost all of it is noise. There's the static hiss from the birth of the universe itself, the rhythmic pulses from dead stars called pulsars, and the constant, annoying crackle of human-made interference, passing satellites, airplane radar, even the occasional microwave oven in the kitchen down the hall. Finding something new meant learning to ignore all that. It required a special kind of patience, a quality David had in abundance. He was a quiet man by nature. While some of his colleagues were brilliant fireworks, full of big ideas and loud conversations, David was a steady, glowing ember. He spoke softly, thought deeply, and believed that the biggest secrets of the cosmos weren't shouted but murmured. He would sit for hours, his eyes moving line by line down the code on his screen, his hand resting on the mouse. His friends sometimes joked that he could hear the planets align. On this particular morning, his coffee mug, a chipped one with a faded cartoon of a rocket, was half full and growing cold. He was reviewing data from a patch of sky he'd studied a dozen times before. His focus was on a known pulsar, a cosmic lighthouse whose steady blink they used to calibrate their instruments. The data from that day months ago had a note attached to it, a small digital flag left by a previous researcher. It simply said, RFI, 5-minute sat pass. RFI, radio frequency interference. A passing satellite. It was the most common note in the world of radio astronomy. It was the equivalent of finding a do not disturb sign on a hotel door. You just moved on. Everyone did. But as David's eyes scanned the data surrounding that 5-minute block, something caught his attention. It was a tiny thing, a feeling more than anything concrete. The signal from the satellite should have been a clean, structured thing. Satellites talk in a language humans designed. This was different. It was a messy, powerful spike that seemed to start at a high frequency and then sweep down to a lower one in the blink of an eye. It was less like a spoken word and more like a scream. He leaned closer to the screen, his brow furrowed. He clicked a few keys, zooming in on the anomaly. The spike was incredibly short, lasting less than 1,000th of a second. A human breath was an eternity compared to it, but in that sliver of time, the line on his graph shot up into a jagged mountain peak. His first thought was, glitch, a bug in the software, a cosmic ray hitting the detector wrong. It happened. He marked the spot with a digital sticky note and moved on with his work. But for the rest of the morning, his mind kept drifting back to it. It was like a song you hear once and can't get out of your head. During his lunch break, sitting outside with a sandwich, he watched the clouds drift over the lush green hills surrounding the observatory. The giant dish, over 300 meters wide, lay in the valley below like a fallen silver moon. That strange little signal popped back into his head. What if it wasn't a glitch? What if it was real? That what if is the engine of every scientific discovery. It's a small, fragile thing, easily crushed by logic and skepticism. But David, in his patient way, decided to give it a little room to breathe. He wasn't going to announce anything. He wasn't going to get excited. He was just going to be curious. He finished his lunch and walked back to the control room, the hum of the telescope welcoming him back. Instead of continuing with his assigned task, he opened a new window on his computer. He began to write a small, simple program. Its job was to be a digital sieve. It would take that 5-minute block of data and filter out everything that looked like a known satellite signature, everything that matched the profile of airplane radar, everything that could be explained. He ran the program. The screen flickered, lines of code scrolling past. When it finished, he looked at the graph again. The mountain peak was still there. It was isolated now, standing alone in a sea of flat, quiet data. It was no longer hidden by the noise of the passing satellite. It was just itself, a single, colossal, and utterly mysterious burst of energy from the depths of space. David sat back in his chair, the old springs creaking. The control room felt quieter than usual. The only sound was the hum of the machine and the beating of his own heart. He stared at the lonely peak on the screen. It wasn't much to look at, just a jagged red line on a black background. But to David, in that moment, it felt like the first footprint on a deserted beach. A giant had passed by, and he was the only one who had seen its shadow. The rest of the day passed in a blur of routine tasks, but for David, the world had shifted slightly on its axis. That single jagged peak on his monitor was like a splinter in his mind. He tried to focus on his official work, calibrating data, running standard analyses, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the silent, empty office and the ghost in the machine he had found there. He was a logical man, trained to distrust excitement. In science, the most thrilling discovery is usually just a mistake, a loose cable, a software bug, a prank by a postdoc. He ran through a mental checklist of all the usual suspects, the mundane explanations that kept the universe boring and predictable. That evening, he walked back to his small, rented house on the hillside overlooking the observatory. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The giant dish below began to glow faintly in the twilight, a man-made pupil staring up at the emerging stars. Normally, this view filled him with a sense of peace. Tonight, it felt like a question. Inside, his house was a reflection of his mind, orderly, but with pockets of deep focus. A guitar leaned against a bookshelf overflowing with science fiction novels and textbooks. A half-finished mug of tea sat on the coffee table. He made himself a simple dinner of rice and beans, the familiar routine calming his buzzing thoughts. After eating, he didn't turn on the television. Instead, he sat on his small porch, the chorus of coqui frogs providing a rhythmic soundtrack to the night. He stared at the dish. "What are you?" he thought, directing the question not at the telescope, but at the tiny, silent blip in its memory. Was it a glitch? It certainly could be. The Arecibo telescope was a marvel, but it was also a complex and aging beast. It had its quirks and moods, but the more he replayed the steps in his head, the less it felt like a glitch. A glitch is often messy, corrupting data around it. This was clean, isolated. It had a specific shape, a fingerprint. It started high and swept low. It was a sound, he realized. A sound from space. He tried to imagine it. If you could hear it, what would it be? Not a long musical note. It was too fast. It would be a pop, a cosmic snap of the fingers. Here one moment, gone the next. The next morning, he was back at his desk earlier than usual. The anomaly, as he had started to call it in his head, was waiting for him. He opened the file again. This time he decided to measure it. He needed to understand its power. He pulled up the data from the pulsar they had been officially studying that day, a known steady cosmic clock. He compared the energy of the pulsar's steady beat to the energy of his one mysterious burst. The numbers that came back on his screen made him lean back and take a deep breath. The calculation was rough, but the result was staggering. That millisecond burst, that tiny pop, had released more energy than our sun puts out in over 30 days. He ran the calculation again, checking his math. The result was the same. A flash, shorter than the blink of an eye, outshining the star that gives life to our entire planet. A chill ran down his spine, a mix of awe and pure scientific terror. This wasn't just an anomaly. This was a monster, but a monster of what? His own imagination? That was still the most likely answer. He knew he had to be his own worst critic. He had to try and kill his own discovery before he could ever dream of showing it to anyone else. This began what he later thought of as his quiet obsession. For the next several weeks, during lulls in his official work or during his free time, he became a digital detective. He created a special folder on his computer, hidden amongst less interesting files, and named it Project Ghost. He spent hours learning everything he could about the telescope's systems. He read technical manuals about the receivers, the amplifiers, the miles of wiring. He looked for any possible way the instrument could have created such a spike itself. He modeled the effects of a cosmic ray hitting the electronics. He simulated power surges. Each time, the simulated glitches looked nothing like his clean, unique burst. He then turned his attention to Earth. Could it be a secret military test? A new type of radar? He spent days cross-referencing the exact time and direction the telescope was pointing with databases of satellite passes and airplane flight paths. It was painstaking, boring work, clicking through lists of numbers, comparing coordinates, checking timestamps. His eyes grew tired and the hum of the computer became a constant companion. And then he found a possible match. A Russian satellite used for communications was in roughly the same part of the sky at roughly the same time. His heart sank a little. This was it. The boring, simple explanation. He felt a strange pang of disappointment mixed with relief. The universe was safe and predictable again. He wrote a more sophisticated filtering program, one designed specifically to remove the unique signature of that Russian satellite. He fed the raw data into it, the 5-minute block containing both the satellite's noise and his burst. He hit enter and watched the progress bar fill. The program finished. He looked at the new, cleaned-up graph. The burst was still there. It was now completely isolated. The Russian satellite signal was gone, a faint, smooth smear in the data. But the burst stood proud and sharp, like a single, defiant mountain in a flat desert. It wasn't from the satellite. It had simply been hiding behind it. This was the moment the quiet obsession turned into something more serious. This was no longer a maybe. This was a signal. It was real. It came from deep space, and as far as he could tell, no one on Earth had ever seen anything like it before. He saved the final, cleaned graph. He looked around the office. A colleague was laughing on the phone. Another was typing loudly. The world was going on, completely unaware that David was sitting on a secret that could shake the world of astronomy. He felt the weight of it. What do you do when you think you found something impossible? Who do you tell? And more importantly, who would believe a quiet, patient student who claimed to have found a giant where everyone else had seen only noise? The secret was a heavy thing to carry. For days, David walked through the observatory halls feeling like he had a ghost following him. He'd be in the cafeteria, listening to his colleagues talk about their research on dust clouds or planetary atmospheres, and he'd have to stop himself from just blurting it out. I found a thing. A giant, screaming thing from the other side of the universe. But he didn't. He knew how it would sound. A young graduate student, finding something every other senior scientist had missed, in old data no less. It was the perfect recipe for embarrassment. They would smile, nod politely, and then gently explain to him all the reasons he was wrong. He could already hear their kind, condescending voices. Ah, the perils of data mining. You can find patterns in anything if you look hard enough, David. So, he kept the secret. But it began to change his work. His assigned tasks, which he used to find meditative, now felt frustratingly slow. He was going through the motions, his real mind always back in that folder labeled Project Ghost. He found himself staring at the star chart on the wall behind his desk, his eyes tracing the patch of sky where it had happened. It was an unremarkable spot, devoid of bright stars or known nebulae. It was just empty, which made the burst even more strange. What was out there? The weight of it became too much to carry alone. He needed a second opinion. But it had to be the right person. Someone smart but not a show-off. Someone rigorous but open-minded. Someone who wouldn't laugh. His eyes landed on Dr. Amelia Rossi. Dr. Rossi was one of the senior astronomers at Arecibo. She was in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a reputation for being fiercely logical, but kind. She didn't suffer fools, but she was known to patiently guide young students who showed genuine curiosity. Most importantly, she had a history of investigating weird, unexplained signals herself. She understood that the universe was a strange place. Gathering his courage took a week. He practiced what he would say in the shower, on his walk to work, while making his evening tea. He wasn't going to announce a discovery. He was going to ask for help with a puzzle. Finally, on a Thursday afternoon when the office was quiet, he saw her pouring a coffee in the small kitchenette. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was it, Dr. Rossi? He said, his voice a little tighter than he wanted. She turned, smiling. David, hello. How's the data dredging going? Find any treasure yet? Her casual joke almost made him lose his nerve. She had no idea how close she was to the truth. Actually, he said, clutching his laptop to his chest like a shield, I found something odd. I was wondering if you might have a few minutes to look at it. I can't quite figure it out. Of course, she said, her smile softening into a look of professional interest. My office. 10 minutes? Those 10 minutes felt like an hour. David sat in the chair opposite her desk, his laptop open on his knees. Her office was comforting. It was messy, but with the organized chaos of a busy mind. Books were stacked on every surface, and a detailed map of the moon was pinned to the wall. She came in, sat down, and took a sip of her coffee. All right, David, show me this puzzle of yours. He took a deep breath. Okay, so I was looking at this old data set from September. There was a 5-minute flag for satellite interference. He turned his laptop around to show her the first messy graph. But when I was cleaning it up, I noticed this little spike here, buried in the noise. He pointed to the spot that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. Dr. Rossi leaned forward, her eyes narrowing. She didn't say anything for a long moment. It's sharp. Yes, David said, a flicker of hope in his chest. She hadn't dismissed it immediately. He then walked her through his process, just as he had done in his own mind. He showed her the raw data, then the data with the satellite signal filtered out. He explained how he'd ruled out aircraft radar, and then how he'd modeled instrumental glitches and cosmic rays. He spoke slowly and carefully, his finger tracing the lines on the graph. He was not a salesman. He was a tour guide, showing her every step of the path he had walked. He showed her the final, isolated burst, standing alone on the screen. And this is it, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. After all the filtering, it's still there. Dr. Rossi was silent for a long time, staring at the sharp, solitary peak. She reached for her coffee, took a slow sip, and put it down again. The only sound was the hum of her computer. David, she said finally, her tone neutral and measured. This is interesting. It wasn't a celebration, but it wasn't a rejection. It was a scientist's version of, okay, you have my attention. The first thing that comes to my mind, she continued, is something terrestrial but reflected. A piece of space junk, maybe, tumbling and catching the sun just right, creating a flash we can see. David had thought of that. I checked the space junk catalog for that vector. Nothing was in the right position. She nodded slowly. What about a solar flare? A burst from the sun can create all sorts of interference. I cross-referenced it with solar activity logs from that day, David said, having prepared for this very question. It was a quiet day for the sun. And the signal's dispersion. It doesn't match a solar origin. It looks extragalactic. The word hung in the air between them. Extragalactic, meaning from beyond our own Milky Way galaxy, from the vast dark emptiness between galaxies. It was a staggering thought. Dr. Rossi let out a long, slow breath. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze moving from the laptop screen to David's anxious face. She could see the hours of work in his tired eyes. She could see the patience in the care he had taken. Okay, she said again, this time with more weight. This is very, very interesting, and more than a little crazy. A small smile touched her lips. The good kind of crazy. She stood up and walked to her whiteboard, picking up a marker. All right, let's be detectives. We need to try and break this. We need to come up with every single possible, boring, ordinary explanation and rule it out, one by one. If it survives all of that. She trailed off, leaving the incredible possibility unspoken. She turned to him, her expression now serious and focused. David, don't talk about this with anyone else yet. Not a word. The second this gets out, the whole circus will come to town. We need to be sure. We need to be rock-solid sure. David felt a massive wave of relief. The weight was no longer his alone. He had an ally. A smart, experienced, and cautious ally. The ghost had a second witness. As he left her office, the hum of the observatory felt different. It was no longer just the sound of a machine. It was the sound of a hunt, and he was now part of a team of two, chasing the whisper of a giant. The dynamic had shifted. David was no longer a lone detective working in the shadows. He was now an apprentice on a top-secret mission. Dr. Rossi's office became their war room. The whiteboard, once covered in complex equations about stellar evolution, was now dedicated to a single, sharp line on a graph. Dr. Rossi was a brilliant partner. Where David was patient and meticulous, she was fast and fiercely logical. She attacked the problem from angles he hadn't even considered. "All right, David," she said one afternoon, her marker squeaking against the whiteboard. She had written the burst at the top and drawn a line down the middle. One side was labeled "It's real." The other, much longer side was labeled "It's not." Under the "It's not" column, she had already written,
"Satellite,
"Aircraft D,
solar flare."
instrument glitch, basic." "Let's get mean," she said, a glint in her eye. "Let's try to kill your baby." David nodded, understanding the grim necessity of it. For a discovery to live, you had to be willing to murder it with skepticism. "The first big one," she said, tapping the board. "Could it be a terrestrial signal that bounced off something? Off the moon? Or a piece of debris?" So they dove into the math of reflections. David spent 3 days calculating signal paths, angles, and travel times. If a signal from Earth had bounced off the moon and accidentally found its way into the telescope's receiver, it would have a specific delay and would look a certain way. He modeled it, creating a simulated bounced signal and comparing it to their burst. They didn't match. The burst was cleaner, more direct. It came straight from the void. "Okay, moon bounce is out," Dr. Rossi said, drawing a line through it on the whiteboard. "What about internal interference? Not a simple glitch, but something deeper in the system. A power surge from the cafeteria microwave is one thing. But what about the receiver itself? Could it have had a hiccup?" This was a harder problem. To prove it wasn't the telescope itself malfunctioning, they needed to see if any other instruments had recorded the same strange signal at the same time. It was a long shot. They reached out, quietly and carefully, to a few other radio observatories around the world, asking if they had been observing the same patch of sky at that exact millisecond. The replies trickled in one by one. No, nothing. No one else had seen it. This was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it made it less likely to be a local Earth-based signal, which would have been picked up by other telescopes. On the other hand, it made their single data point feel very, very lonely. If it was a real cosmic event, why had only Arecibo seen it? The universe is big, but an event that powerful should have left more of a trace. The weeks turned into a month. The "It's Not" list on the whiteboard grew longer, with more and more items crossed out. But the "It's Real" side remained terrifyingly empty, save for that one stubborn data point. The pressure was starting to build, not from the outside world, but from within David himself. He began to have doubts. What if they were both wrong? What if they were chasing a phantom, a coincidence of noise so perfect that it fooled all their tests? He started dreaming about the burst, the jagged red line sometimes transforming into a mountain he had to climb, or a wall he couldn't get past. One evening, he was working late, the office dark and silent around him. He was running the same data through the same filtering program for what felt like the 100th time, hoping for a different result, a flaw he had missed. He was tired, his eyes stung, and the constant hum of the computers felt like it was drilling into his skull. Frustration boiled over. He slammed his hand on the desk, the sudden noise shocking in the quiet room. "Just be something," he whispered angrily to the screen. "Be a glitch. Be a mistake. Just be something I can understand." He put his head in his hands. The loneliness of the search was crushing him. He was fighting a ghost, and the ghost was winning. The next morning, Dr. Rossi found him at his desk, looking defeated. He hadn't shaved, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "David," she said softly, pulling up a chair. "You're burning out. I don't know what else to do," he admitted, his voice heavy. "We can't prove it's real. We can only fail to prove it's fake. That's not how science is supposed to work." "You're right, it's not," she agreed. "But that's also the frontier. When you find something truly new, the rules are fuzzy." "Look," she said, pointing to the crowded whiteboard in her office. "Look at all the things it is not. That list is impressive. That is real work. You have done what few others would have the patience for." She paused, letting her words sink in. "The fact that it's lonely, that no one else saw it, that might be the most important clue of all." "What do you mean?" David asked. "Maybe it wasn't a one-time event, but it was a one-direction event," she explained. "A lighthouse beam. If a lighthouse is spinning, ships from all directions see the light. But if it just flashes once in one single specific direction, only one ship sees it. Maybe we were the only ship in the ocean that was looking in exactly the right place at exactly the right millisecond. The idea was stunning. It transformed the burst from a possible mistake into a possible message. A signal, not meant for anyone, but seen by pure, dumb luck. It rekindled a spark in David. The exhaustion was still there, but the wonder returned. They weren't just trying to kill a ghost anymore. They were trying to understand the nature of a flash in the dark. Was it a cosmic accident? Or a beacon? They decided they needed a new approach. They couldn't prove the past, but they could search for the future. They began to draw up plans for a new observing campaign. They would point Arecibo at that same unremarkable patch of sky for hours and hours, hoping against hope that the universe would be kind enough to repeat itself. It was a long shot, a gamble. But as David sat with Dr. Rossi, sketching out the proposal, he felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in weeks. The hunt was back on. They were no longer just defending a strange piece of data. They were now actively listening, their giant ear tuned to the silence, waiting for another whisper from the giant. The proposal for the new observing campaign was a strange document. It couldn't say, "We are looking for a mysterious, universe-shattering burst that might not be real." Instead, it was filled with careful, scientific language about follow-up observations of an anomalous transient event and characterizing the radio environment of a quiet field. It was a boring mask for an incredibly exciting mission. To their surprise and relief, they were granted the time. The Senior Review Committee, intrigued by Dr. Rossi's reputation and the solid groundwork they had laid in their report, gave them 3 precious 12-hour sessions on the telescope. The first session felt like a vigil. The control room was quiet, lit only by the glow of the monitors. The giant dish outside was now pointed, unmoving, at the exact coordinates of the original burst. It was like staring at a single blank pixel on a massive television screen, waiting for it to light up. David and Dr. Rossi took shifts. She would go home to sleep, and he would stay, watching the data flow in real time. The green lines on the screen danced with the usual gentle wiggles of cosmic background noise. It was the sound of silence. Every hour or so, a known satellite would drift through the field of view, causing a predictable spike, and David's heart would leap for a second before his trained eye recognized it for what it was. During the long, dark hours, his mind would wander. He thought about the distance the signal must have traveled. Billions of light years, perhaps. It meant the burst didn't happen now. It happened when Earth was still young, when the first simple life forms were just beginning to stir in the oceans. That ancient light, that unimaginable energy, had been racing through the void all that time, and by a 1 in a trillion chance, it had ended its journey here, in this control room, on his screen. The thought was so immense it made him feel dizzy. The sunrise after the first session was beautiful, painting the sky in soft pastels. But to David it felt like a defeat. The sky had remained silent. The second session was the same. 12 more hours of nothing. The initial excitement began to curdle into a familiar anxiety. The one-directional lighthouse theory was beautiful, but what if the lighthouse had only ever flashed that one single time in all of cosmic history? What if they were waiting for an event that would never, ever happen again? Before the third and final session, David was in the break room, stirring a cup of tea that had gone cold. He hadn't realized Dr. Rossi was there until she spoke. "You know," she said, leaning against the counter, "the most likely outcome tonight is more silence." "I know," David replied, not looking up from his cup. "And that's okay," she said, her voice firm but kind. "It doesn't mean we were wrong. It just means the universe is sparing with its secrets. If these things were easy to see, someone would have found them decades ago. The fact that we saw it once is the miracle. Everything else is just gravy." David nodded, but he didn't fully believe it. He wanted confirmation. He wanted to hear the giant's voice again, not just its echo. The final session began. This was their last chance. The atmosphere in the control room was tense. They had invited a few other trusted colleagues to help monitor, explaining they were looking for rare transient phenomena. The room was fuller, but the silence was just as deep. Every person was staring at their own monitor, a group of hunters waiting in a blind. Hours ticked by. 10 p.m., midnight, 2 a.m. The data stream was a flat, quiet river. Then, at 3:17 a.m., it happened. On David's screen, a spike, a sharp, violent, beautiful spike. It was there and gone in a millisecond, a perfect twin to the one in his old data. For a second, nobody moved. The silence in the room was absolute. David's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't speak. He just stared, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Then, from the other side of the room, a soft, stunned whisper from one of the other astronomers.
Whoa!
That single word broke the spell. David's eyes snapped to Dr. Rossi. She was already looking at him, her face a mask of pure, undiluted shock. Her mouth was slightly open. She pointed a trembling finger at her own screen, where the same spike was recorded. "It's back," she breathed, the words barely audible. Suddenly, the control room erupted. Chairs scraped back as people jumped to their feet. There was a rush of bodies towards David and Dr. Rossi's stations. Was that it? Is that the thing? "Play it back!
Slow it down!
Check the dispersion measure, now!" The room was filled with a chaotic, joyful energy. David finally found his voice. "It's the same," he said, his own voice shaking with emotion. "The profile, the sweep, it's identical. It's the same thing." He pulled up the old data and put the new signal right beside it on the big central monitor. The two jagged lines were siblings, almost perfect mirrors of each other. In that moment, everything changed. The lonely ghost had a family. The one-time event was now a thing, a real, repeatable, detectable phenomenon. David was no longer a student with a crazy idea. He was the discoverer of a new class of cosmic object. He looked around the buzzing, excited room. People were clapping him on the back. He saw the respect in their eyes, the awe. He should have felt triumphant, and a part of him did. But a bigger part of him felt a profound and simple relief. It was like finally exhaling after holding his breath for months. He caught Dr. Rossi's eye again. The shock on her face had been replaced by a wide, brilliant smile. She gave him a small, firm nod. It was a nod that said, "You were right. All along, the hunt was over. Now the real work was about to begin." They had not just found a clue. They had found a new path in the dark forest of the universe, and they were the first ones to set foot on it. The giant had not just left a single footprint. It had taken a second step, and this time everyone had seen it. The excitement in the control room was a living thing. It buzzed in the air, sharp and electric, like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. For a few glorious minutes, they were not scientists bound by procedure. They were just people who had witnessed a small, distant miracle. Someone let out a whoop of joy. Another laughed, a sound of pure disbelief. David just stood there, a wide, goofy grin spreading across his face. The weight of months of doubt and secrecy finally lifting from his shoulders. But the celebration was short-lived. Dr. Rossi, though she was smiling, quickly became the captain of the ship again. "All right, everyone, settle down," she called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "We have work to do. This is not the time for partying. This is the time to be more careful than we have ever been." The room snapped back to attention. She was right. The feeling in the room shifted from celebration to a focused, intense urgency. They had caught the ghost, but now they had to prove it wasn't a trick of the light. "David," she said, turning to him, her eyes blazing with intensity, "I want you to run the full diagnostic on the receiver. I want to know the health of every component at exactly 3:17 a.m. On it," he said, his fingers already flying across the keyboard. "Maria," she said to another astronomer, "I want you to pull all the logs from our weather station and any other local monitoring equipment. I want to know if a plane, a bird, anything at all was in our airspace at that exact moment. Ben, get on the horn to the other observatories, quietly. Ask if they recorded any unusual activity in this general region of the sky at that precise time. Don't tell them what we saw. Just ask." The room became a hive of quiet, efficient activity. The initial joy was channeled into a river of rigorous checking. This was the unglamorous side of discovery, the paperwork. They had to build a fortress of evidence around their one beautiful data point. David ran the diagnostics. The telescope was in perfect health. Maria confirmed the skies were clear of any known interference. Ben reported back that no other observatory had seen anything. The burst for the second time belonged only to them. As the sun rose, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, the team finally began to disperse, exhausted but exhilarated. David and Dr. Rossi were left alone in the control room, the empty coffee cups and scattered printouts the only evidence of the night's chaos. We have to write the paper, Dr. Rossi said, her voice hoarse with tiredness. And you, David, will be the first author. David looked up, stunned. Me? But you... She cut him off with a wave of her hand. No, this is your discovery. You found the first one. You did the hard, lonely work of believing in it when no one else did. My name will be on the paper, of course, but yours comes first. That's how it should be. The significance of her words washed over him. First author. It meant that forever in the scientific record, his name would be attached to this thing. It was a career-making moment, and she was handing it to him without a second thought. He felt a surge of gratitude so strong he couldn't speak. He just nodded. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of a different kind. The war room whiteboard was erased, and in its place came drafts of a scientific paper. Writing it was a painstaking process. Every word had to be chosen with care. They couldn't say, "We discovered a giant burst from an alien civilization," even though the thought had crossed everyone's mind. They had to be dry, factual, and humble. They called it a bright, dispersed radio burst. They described its properties, its incredible shortness, its power, its sweeping frequency. They meticulously listed all the things it wasn't, all the tests from the whiteboard that it had passed. The paper was a careful, cautious argument, building slowly to an incredible conclusion. Finally, the day came to submit it. David sat at his computer, Dr. Rossi looking over his shoulder. The submission page for the prestigious journal Science was open on the screen. His finger hovered over the mouse. Ready? Dr. Rossi asked softly. He took a deep breath. He thought about the lonely nights, the frustration, the doubt, the moment of pure shock in the control room. He thought about the giant whispering from the dark. He clicked, Submit. There was no fanfare, no triumphant music, just a bland confirmation screen. Manuscript IST 1999-0442 submitted successfully. And just like that, their secret was no longer theirs. It was now in the hands of the world. The waiting began. The response would not be a quick, excited celebration like in the control room. It would be a slow, grinding process of peer review, a gauntlet of the world's toughest experts picking apart their work, looking for any flaw, any mistake. As they walked out of the office that evening, David felt a new kind of anxiety. The scientific community could be a brutal place. He had just thrown a rock into a quiet pond, and he had no idea if the ripples would bring admiration or a tidal wave of ridicule. The hunt was over. Now the trial was about to begin. The first few weeks after submitting the paper felt like living in a bubble. The world outside the observatory continued on, completely unaware of the earthquake that David and his small team had just triggered in their understanding of the universe. David tried to return to his normal routine, but it was impossible. His focus was shot. Every time his email inbox chimed, his heart would do a little flip, wondering if it was a response from the journal. He found himself spending more time at home, strumming his guitar absently, the melodies going nowhere. He'd pick up a science fiction novel and put it down again, the fictional aliens feeling less exciting than the very real, very mysterious signal he had helped to find. The waiting was a special kind of torture. It was quieter than the doubt, but somehow heavier. Dr. Rossi, sensing his anxiety, tried to reassure him. Peer review is a slow dance, David, she said one afternoon, finding him staring blankly at a screen full of star maps. It takes time. The reviewers are doing their job just like we did ours. But David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being judged, and harshly. He started reading old controversial papers online, seeing how the scientific community had torn apart ideas that challenged the status quo. What if their paper was just another one for that pile? Finally, after a month of silence, the response arrived. It wasn't a single email, but a bundle of documents forwarded from the journal. The subject line was, Decision on Manuscript AST 1999-0442. David's hands were trembling as he opened it. He read the covering letter from the editor. The words were polite, neutral. The reviewers have provided their comments. Significant interest. However, major revisions are required before we can consider publication. His heart sank. Major revisions. It was the polite way of saying, you have not convinced us. He scrolled down to the reviewers' reports. There were 3 of them. The comments were brutal. Reviewer number 1 was skeptical. They focused on the terrestrial interference argument. The authors have not sufficiently ruled out a previously unknown type of radar or military signal, they wrote. The fact that only Arecibo detected it strongly suggests a local, man-made origin. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and this single repeat observation does not meet that standard. Reviewer number 2 was even harsher. They attacked their methods. The data processing pipeline described is unconventional. The filtering algorithms could easily create artificial signals. I would like to see a raw, unprocessed data stream to verify the signal is not an artifact of their own analysis. Reviewer number 3 was the shortest, and in some ways the most devastating. It simply read, "This is an interesting anomaly, but without a known physical mechanism to explain it, and without detection by any other instrument, it is premature to claim a discovery of a new astrophysical phenomenon. I recommend rejection." David felt the air leave his lungs. It was worse than he had imagined. They weren't just being questioned. They were being called incompetent. The words unconventional, artifact, and premature felt like physical blows. All those months of work, all the careful checking, reduced to a few paragraphs of cold clinical doubt. He printed the reports and walked, numb, to Dr. Rossi's office. He didn't say anything, just placed the pages on her desk. She read them slowly, her expression unreadable. When she finished, she put the pages down and let out a long, slow breath. She wasn't angry. She looked thoughtful. "Well," she said, a small, wry smile touching her lips. "They didn't just roll over, did they?" David was stunned. "How can you smile?"
They're destroying us.
"No, they're not," she said calmly, tapping the papers. "This is the process. This is the gauntlet. Look at what they're actually saying. They're not saying we're liars. They're asking hard questions, and they're right to ask them." She stood up and went to the whiteboard, which had remained blank since they'd submitted the paper. She picked up a marker. Reviewer 1 says we didn't rule out a new type of radar. Okay, so we do a deeper dive. We contact the Pentagon if we have to. We get a full list of every test, every satellite launch, everything that could possibly have been in the sky at that moment. We build a stronger wall. Reviewer 2 wants raw data and questions our filtering. Fine, we send them the rawest data possible. We write a new appendix for the paper, walking through every single step of the filtering, explaining why each decision was made. We make our process so transparent it's like glass. She turned to him, her eyes alive with the challenge. And Reviewer 3? Reviewer 3. No known physical mechanism. That's the best one of all, David. How is that the best one? David asked, bewildered. Because it's not a criticism of our work, she exclaimed. It's an admission of ignorance. They're saying, we don't know what this is, so we don't believe it. Our job isn't to explain what it is. Our job is to prove that it is. Let the theorists lose sleep over the how. We just have to prove the what. Her energy was infectious. The crushing disappointment began to recede, replaced by a stubborn determination. The reviewers hadn't ended the journey. They had just given them a new, more detailed map. For the next 2 months, they worked harder than ever. It was like the early days of Project Ghost, but now they had a specific list of enemies to defeat. David felt like a lawyer preparing for a trial, gathering every piece of evidence, preparing for every possible argument against them. They compiled dossiers on military testing schedules. They wrote a 50-page technical document just on their data processing method. They made their case ironclad, finally. They bundled it all up, the revised paper, the new appendices, the detailed point-by-point responses to every reviewer's comment, and sent it back into the world. The second wait began. But this time it felt different. David wasn't anxious. He was proud. They had faced the fire, and they had not backed down. They had answered every challenge with data, with logic, with patience. Whatever happened next, he knew they had done everything they possibly could. He had learned a difficult but vital lesson. Discovering something new wasn't just about seeing it first. It was about being brave enough to defend it. The second wait was different. It was no longer a tense, nervous silence, but a quiet, steady confidence. David had done all he could. The ball was now in the court of the scientific community, and he found a strange peace in that. He even managed to get a full night's sleep, something that had been rare for months. Then the email arrived. It was a simple notification from the journal. A decision has been made on your manuscript. David took a deep breath, clicked it open, and read the first line. We are pleased to inform you That was all he needed to see. A wave of pure, uncomplicated relief washed over him so powerfully he had to put his head down on his desk for a moment. He then read the rest. The paper, The Arecibo Bright Dispersed Radio Burst, by David N. and Dr. Amelia Rossi, had been accepted for publication. The reviewers were satisfied. The fortress of evidence had held. He didn't whoop or run through the halls. He simply stood up, walked to Dr. Rossi's office, and stood in her doorway. "It's in," he said, his voice remarkably calm. She looked up from her computer, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. "Of course it is," she said, as if there had never been any doubt. The paper was published a few weeks later. At first it was like a stone dropped into a very deep, very quiet pond. There was a small ripple in the astronomy community. A few experts read it intrigued. Some wrote blog posts. But for the most part, the world was busy with other things. David, however, was now a minor celebrity within the small world of radio astronomy. He was invited to give a talk at a conference. The thought terrified him. Speaking in front of a room full of the very people who had been so skeptical was daunting. The day of his talk arrived. The conference hall was large and filled with hundreds of faces, many of them belonging to scientists whose names he knew from textbooks. He stood backstage, his notes trembling in his hands. Dr. Rossi gave him a thumbs up from the front row. He walked to the podium, the lights bright in his eyes. He cleared his throat, his voice echoing a little in the microphone. "A little over a year ago," he began, "I was looking at some old data from Arecibo." He told them the story. Not just the science, but the human story. He spoke about the boring task of sifting through data. He described the moment the anomaly caught his eye. He talked about the lonely obsession, the patient explanation to Dr. Rossi, and the long nights trying to kill the idea. He was honest about the doubt, the frustration, the crushing feedback from the reviewers. He showed them the graph of the first burst, the lonely mountain peak. Then he clicked to the next slide, showing the second burst, its twin, captured during their vigil. A soft murmur went through the crowd. He didn't use complicated jargon. He spoke in the same simple, clear terms he had used with Dr. Rossi that first day. He was a guide, leading them on the journey he had taken. He explained the patient work of ruling things out, one by one. He showed them the evidence, not as a triumphant declaration, but as a logical conclusion they could all reach with him. When he finished, he said, "So, we don't know what this is. We only know that it is. It's a thing, a real thing in our universe that we cannot yet explain." "Thank you." For a second there was silence. Then the applause started. It wasn't wild or roaring, but it was warm, respectful, and sustained. It was the sound of acceptance. After the talk, a line of people formed to speak with him. An elderly professor with a kind face shook his hand. "Young man," he said, "that was one of the most honest presentations I've seen in years. You took us on the adventure with you." Another researcher came up, excited. "Your data processing method was brilliant. We're going to apply it to our own archives." David was surrounded. People were not attacking him. They were engaging with him. They were asking smart questions, offering their own theories, treating him as an equal. He saw Dr. Rossi at the edge of the crowd, watching him with a look of pure pride. That night, at the conference dinner, he felt a sense of belonging he had never felt before. He was no longer an outsider with a crazy idea. He was a contributor. He had added a new piece, however small and mysterious, to the great puzzle of the cosmos. But as he lay in his hotel room bed, staring at the ceiling, a new thought crept in. The paper was published. The talk was a success. The scientific community was intrigued. But the fundamental mystery remained, larger and more profound than ever. What was it? They had proven the what, but the why and the how were still vast, dark oceans of ignorance. His discovery hadn't provided an answer. It had simply asked a much, much bigger question. The giant had been heard, but it had not spoken its name. The hunt was over, but the deeper mystery had just begun. Returning to the Arecibo Observatory after the conference felt like coming home to a different place. The humming control room was the same, the lush green hills were the same, but David was not. He was no longer just a student. He was the man who had found the burst. People who had barely noticed him before now nodded to him with respect in the hallways. For a few weeks there was a buzz. Other research teams requested their data. Theorists, the scientists who build mathematical models of the universe, began publishing papers with wild ideas. Maybe the bursts were from colliding neutron stars, or the dying screams of stars being swallowed by black holes. Others suggested even more exotic possibilities. Cosmic strings vibrating, or even, in hushed, careful tones, signals from an advanced civilization. David watched this explosion of ideas from the sidelines with a strange feeling. It was like he had lit a small fuse and now everyone was watching the spectacular fireworks. He was proud, but he also felt disconnected. The burst was becoming a theory, an idea. It was losing its connection to that quiet, lonely moment at his desk. He tried to find the next big thing. He spent hours looking at other data sets, searching for another anomaly. But his heart wasn't in it. It felt forced. How could he ever top this? He felt a pressure, both from himself and from the outside world, to have another brilliant idea, and it was paralyzing him. One afternoon, he was sitting with Dr. Rossi, feeling frustrated. "I feel like I'm just going through the motions," he admitted. "I look at the data, but I don't see anything. What if that was it? What if that was the one interesting thing I ever do?" Dr. Rossi listened patiently. She swiveled in her chair to look out the window at the massive dish. "David," she said, "you're thinking like a fisherman who caught a legendary one-of-a-kind fish. You're disappointed that the next fish you pull up is just an ordinary trout." She turned back to him. "But you didn't just catch a fish. You discovered a whole new species. Your job now isn't to immediately catch another one. Your job is to help everyone else learn how to fish." Her words sank in. The pressure lifted, replaced by a new purpose. He realized the work wasn't over. It had just changed. He didn't need to be the only hunter anymore. He could be a teacher, a guide. He started working with the theorists, explaining the precise details of the signal, its shape, its strength, its sweep, so their models could be more accurate. He helped other observatories set up their own systems to look for these fast, transient events, teaching them the lessons he had learned about patience and careful filtering. He found he enjoyed this new role. He was good at explaining complex things in simple terms. He loved seeing the spark of understanding in a student's eyes, the same spark he had seen in Dr. Rossi's all those months ago. Years began to slip by. The initial excitement around the Lorimer burst, as it was now officially called, named after his advisor, slowly faded from the front pages of science magazines. It settled into the textbooks as a known but still deeply mysterious phenomenon. David finished his PhD and became a full-fledged research scientist at the observatory. He worked on other projects, good and important ones, but the burst was always his first love. And then, in 2007, nearly a decade after he first saw that jagged line on his screen, the news broke. A team in Australia, using the park's radio telescope, detected a burst, then another, and another. They weren't just one-off events. They were happening all the time, flashing across the sky like cosmic fireflies. The park's team had developed new, faster software that could catch these incredibly brief signals. They called them fast radio bursts, or FRBs. The scientific world exploded. The Lorimer burst was no longer a lonely oddity. It was the first of its kind, the prototype, the discovery that had started it all. Reporters called the Arecibo Observatory, asking for interviews with David. "How does it feel to be vindicated?" they asked. "Do you feel justified after all the early skepticism?" David thought about it carefully. He didn't feel vindicated. Vindication was for people who had been fighting a battle. He hadn't been fighting. He had just been curious. He thought of the long, quiet years in between. The work he had done, the students he had helped. The steady, patient progress of science. When he finally gave the interview, he said, "I don't feel justified. I feel grateful. Grateful that the universe decided to give us another clue. My colleagues in Australia didn't prove me right. They proved that the universe is even more interesting than we thought. We all just work here trying to listen." He hung up the phone and walked out of his office. It was evening. The sky was dark, and the stars were beginning to appear. The giant dish was tilted, listening to a new target, hunting for new mysteries. He stood there for a long time, watching. The burst was no longer just his. It belonged to everyone now. It was a piece of a larger puzzle that hundreds of brilliant minds were working on together. And he realized that was a much, much better feeling than being right ever could be. He had been the first to hear the whisper, and now a whole chorus was learning to sing along. Time, as it always does, moved on. The story of the fast radio bursts, the FRBs, became one of the great scientific adventures of the new century. New telescopes were built specifically to hunt for them. Sophisticated computer programs scanned the sky in real time, catching dozens of these fleeting cosmic shouts. They were traced to galaxies billions of light-years away, their immense power hinting at origins involving incredibly dense, violent objects like magnetars, highly magnetic neutron stars. David watched this revolution from the heart of it all. He was no longer the young, anxious student, but a respected senior scientist. His hair had a little gray at the temples, and the lines on his face spoke of years spent squinting at screens and smiling. He had his own students now, bright-eyed and full of questions. One evening, he was working late, much like he had on that night long ago. The office was quiet. One of his new students, a young woman named Chloe, was struggling with a set of data. She was frustrated, her shoulders slumped. "I've been looking at this for a week," she sighed, pushing her chair back. "I thought I saw a pattern, but it's probably just noise." "I'm probably just seeing things," David smiled. He got up, walked over to her desk, and pulled up a spare chair. "Let me see," he said gently. He looked at her screen, at the messy lines of data. He remembered a time when a messy line had changed his life. "You know," he said, his voice soft and warm, "the most important tool in science isn't intelligence. It's patience. The universe doesn't shout, it whispers. And to hear a whisper, you have to be very, very quiet, and you have to listen for a long time." He pointed to a small, almost insignificant bump in her data. "What about this?" Chloe shrugged. "I thought about that, but it's so small, and it's probably just an instrument thing." "Probably," David agreed. "It almost always is. But what if it's not? The first rule is curiosity. The second rule is to be your own worst critic. And the third rule is to never be afraid of being wrong. The biggest discoveries often start with a probably nothing." He spent the next hour with her, not giving her the answers, but asking her questions, guiding her on how to be a detective, showing her how to test her own idea, how to try and break it, just as he had been taught. As he spoke, he had a sudden, vivid memory. He was back in Dr. Rossi's office, a nervous young man with a crazy graph, and she was listening to him with that same calm, patient attention he was now giving to Chloe. The circle felt complete. Later, as he was packing his bag to go home, Chloe looked at him, her frustration replaced by a determined focus. "Thank you, David. I'm going to keep looking at it." "Good," he said. "That's all any of us can do." He walked out of the building and stood under the vast, starry Caribbean sky. The giant Arecibo dish, the silent witness to his life's work, was silhouetted against the Milky Way. It was still listening, as it always would be. He thought about the journey, from a single lonely blip on a screen to a whole new field of astronomy. He thought of the doubt, the long nights, the thrill of discovery, the years of quiet work, and the joy of seeing others continue the search. He didn't feel like a famous discoverer. He felt like a gardener who had by chance found a very strange seed. He had planted it carefully, protected it from doubt, and watered it with patience. And now he was standing in a forest that had grown from that one tiny seed. A forest being explored by countless other gardeners. The mystery of the FRBs was not solved. In many ways it was deeper than ever. But that was the point. Science wasn't about finding final answers. It was about learning to ask better questions. It was a conversation with the universe, a conversation that never ends. He got into his car and started the drive home, the headlights cutting a path through the warm, dark night. The giant was still out there, bursting and flashing in the silence. And back on Earth, a new generation of quiet. Patient listeners were tuning their ears, ready for the next whisper. And that, he thought with a deep and peaceful contentment, was a story far more beautiful than any single discovery could ever be.